Hello everyone and welcome back to a new video. Today I wanted to talk about everything that I read in February. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope February was a good reading month for you all as well. Please let me know how the month went for you. Were there any books you read that became new favorites? I would love to hear just about how your reading month went and how March is going so far as well. I am a little bit sick, hence why I also have a tea with me, and I would also encourage you to grab yourselves a warm drink. Make yourselves cozy as we will be here for a little bit just talking about what I read. I have a London Fog tea latte, which is my favorite tea beverage, and it's just so delicious. I'm addicted. It's so good. So grab yourself something comforting and let's just get into how my reading went in February. A couple of the books I read in February I feel like I will probably talk about for quite a while because they were phenomenal reads. They were both rereads actually, and the first time I read both of the books, I liked them quite a lot, but this second time reading them, it was truly a new experience reading them, and it was just wonderful. So I'm really excited, and let's just get into it. I'm first going to talk about a DNF, and then I will talk about what I'm currently reading, and then we'll talk about what I read. I'm going to talk about the books from my least favorite to my favorite, which is how I usually like to structure my wrap-ups. And there will be timestamps as well, so you can jump around to the different books. Just some quick stats before we get into the wrap-up. I read a total of 5 full-length novels, so it wasn't the greatest reading month in terms of number of books, which is fine. It was really busy with work, so I'm not beating myself up over the number of books I read each month this year. Like I said in my goals video, it's low pressure, and I'm not going to, feel guilty about only reading a certain number of books. That's not at all what matters. The quality of what I'm reading matters, and I had some wonderful and deep reading moments this month, which I'll talk about later. But 5 full-length novels I completed. I read almost half of a very long novel, which is the DNF that I will be talking about shortly. And then I made it about 35-ish% of the way through another very long novel that I plan on finishing in March. I read 1 Christian ancient historical fiction, 1 fantasy, a collection of Regency era short stories, and 2 classics, one of which is from the Regency era. It's by Jane Austen, and the other is basically a classic horror novel. And horror is not my thing, but I adore this book so much. And then I did read some poetry as well, and I'm very excited to talk about all of these books. So the first book that I wanted to talk about is the DNF, and unfortunately that is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This book is a brick. It is very long, and I DNF'd it. I still have the bookmark in. I almost made it to the halfway point. So I was on page 435 and I DNF'd it after chapter 31. I could not do it anymore. This book has been such a drag, and it was bringing me into a reading slump, and it had a really interesting premise. It's set in London in the Regency era, and it's part of the reason that I wanted to read it because in February it was Feb Regency. Feb Regency is a readathon where you celebrate the Regency era, and I didn't intentionally pick books for that readathon. I didn't want to pressure myself to fully participate in the readathon, but I thought, this book works perfectly for it. And I was also buddy reading this with Anne from In Search of Wonder and Kelly from Kelly Reads and Writes. And I don't know if Anne is still reading it. I think Kelly is. I could be wrong, but I was the first to just set this aside. I can't do it anymore. But basically, this book is set in London in the Regency era, and there's this group of men that call themselves magicians. They study magic, but actual magic is no longer a thing in London, and then these 2 men appear and magic kind of comes back into society. I just had no idea where the story was going, and there were a variety of characters introduced that I just didn't really care about, to be completely honest. Nothing in this book captured my interest enough for me to want to keep going after reading almost 450 pages. I could not do it anymore. And then we got into a section that dealt a lot with the Napoleonic Wars, which isn't something that I find boring per se. Like I don't mind at all having the Napoleonic Wars as a backdrop in a book, but it just added to the drag, if that makes sense, that this book had become for me. So I decided to set it aside. I tried reading it physically only. I tried listening to the audiobook, which is narrated by Richard Armitage. Fantastic narrator. I tried reading and listening at the same time. It's just not the book for me. And that is okay. I've also read Piranesi by this author, and that was also not a book for me. So I just think Susanna Clarke is not the author for me. And yeah, that is unfortunately Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. A lot of people really love this book and say it's like a modern classic, but it's just not one that I jive with. So I did actually DNF this March 1st, but I wanted to include it in this wrap up because it's fresh in my memory. And yeah, I am just including March 1st as part of this February wrap up, actually for the poetry as well. A lot of the poetry that I'm including, I started in February and then completed in March. So anyways, that is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Moving on. I am filming this already a few days into March, so there are books that I am currently reading that I started in March, but I'm only going to mention the books that are carryovers from February. So I started Ralph the Heir by Anthony Trollope, and I'm buddy reading that with my friend Elizabeth, and I am about 35% of the way through. And I'm enjoying it. It's a story about inheritance and legitimacy and that kind of thing. We have a character named Ralph who is the heir to his uncle's estate. His uncle also had a son named Ralph, but he was born out of wedlock, and so he cannot inherit anything basically of his father's. And there are a whole bunch of characters that are kind of part of this drama, and it really is a drama, and it's been a bit slow going for me, but I do find with Trollope, he really gets me. Like his characters really grab my heartstrings in a way that I don't realize until we're getting closer to the end, and then I'm like, wow, these characters have my heart. So I'm really, really hopeful that as we get further along in the book, I will, I guess, form a deeper attachment to the characters. As of now, I'm enjoying the story. I just don't absolutely adore it, but I do love Trollope's writing. So that is Ralph the Heir. And I also should be working my way through Middlemarch, but I have not read a single page of this book in February. This will be read though. I have until the end of December to complete this book, so we have time, but I just haven't been in the mood. I need to just listen to my reading mood, because if I pick this up when I don't want to, I'll be miserable, but I'll eventually get to it. And I'm also currently working my way through Wordsworth and Coleridge's Lyrical Ballads. And I'm actually just going to talk about the poems that I finished now. I was going to talk about them later in the video, but when I'm thinking about how I would rank my reads from least favorite to favorite, I don't really know how I would put these poems. It's hard with poetry. I don't really rate the poems. None of them I've given a numerical rating. I just kind of read them. If there were analysis videos available on YouTube, I would watch them and then, I don't know, just write down my thoughts. But I have really been enjoying them, and I love the way that romantic poetry really focuses in on nature, and it's been really interesting. The poems so far have kind of been alternating between Coleridge and Wordsworth, and so far I don't know if I like one more than the other. I think they were both very gifted in their own ways, and I'll mention the poems that I have read. So I've read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is by Coleridge, and loved that poem so much. That one I would give 5 stars. It was fantastic. That one I reread multiple times, and then I listened to the episodes from the Literary Life podcast on the poem, and fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. And then The Foster Mother's Tale, also by Coleridge. That one I found kind of difficult to understand what the point was, to be completely honest. There is another person who has a podcast, but I watched his YouTube video form of his podcast episodes on The Foster Mother's Tale, as well as some of the other poems in this book, and he covered The Foster Mother's Tale and was kind of showing how there are parallels between this poem and Frankenstein. And Mary Shelley and Coleridge, they knew each other, and Mary Shelley would have read this poem before she had written Frankenstein. So it's really interesting to kind of see those parallels. And after reading the poem again, I did definitely see some of those parallels. But I do want to reread Frankenstein and then come back to this poem and see kind of if I can find those parallels even more. And then I read Lines Left Upon a Seat in a Yew Tree Which Stands Near the Lake of Esthwaite, on a desolate part of the shore, yet commanding a beautiful prospect. And that is by Wordsworth, and this one was beautiful. Kind of has the themes of how pride comes before a fall, and it just made me really want to see the Lake District with my own eyes. And this cover actually is a painting of the Lake District, and I just want to go to England so bad. But yeah, that poem was beautiful. My favorite little passage from the first stanza is, "Yet if the wind breathe soft, the curling waves that break against the shore shall lull thy mind by one soft impulse saved from vacancy." So it's like that feeling of listening to the sound of the waves against the shore of the lake just kind of lulls you. And oh my gosh, I just want to go and see the lakes and just sit there and stare at the beauty that the Lake District is. And I'm just going on and on and on. So the next poem was by Coleridge, and that is called The Nightingale. It is a conversational poem written in April of 1798. And there's that idea that nightingales as a bird are quite melancholy in terms of their song. And he was kind of coming against that and saying, no, nightingales are not melancholy, and nothing in nature is melancholy. He quotes actually from Milton, "Most musical, most melancholy bird. A melancholy bird? Oh, idle thought. In nature there is nothing melancholy." At the very end of the poem, Coleridge talks about how one night his son was crying when he was a baby, and he took him outside to look at the moon, and it was so wholesome and sweet. And he included that in the poem, and I just thought that was beautiful. And then I read Wordsworth's The Female Vagrant, and this one was fascinating. And I will also link the video that I listened to, the analysis video for this poem as well below. Such interesting themes. I mean, I literally could not stop writing notes. It was fantastic. It's also set in the Lake District, as a lot of these poems are, and it's kind of a story within a story. It's from a woman's perspective, this woman who is telling her story to this nameless narrator who just happens to be there. And she tells the story of her very idyllic life. She was living with her father, were very pious and religious and had a very happy life, very simple life, very in tune with nature, and they would go fishing and they were very, very simple, happy people. And then this rich guy shows up, wants her father's land, and things just don't go very well for them. And it's kind of a poem of modernization versus the simple country life. It's a narrative poem, so she becomes a mother, and then there's war, and it's a short poem, but a lot happens in this poem, and it packs a punch, and I thought it was really, really good. And I saved The Rime of the Ancient Mariner to talk about last because it was my favorite. It is so, so good. It's another poem that has some similarities to Frankenstein, and Mary Shelley was familiar with this poem as well. And it also gave me Pirates of the Caribbean vibes, actually, which I really loved. It's also quite an easy poem to read as someone who is still very new to poetry and feels very overwhelmed. I still feel very overwhelmed. Anytime I open up this book, I'm like, what am I looking at? I am very, very intimidated every single time I open this book. And really, besides Tennyson and these two gentlemen, I haven't really read any other poetry. I'm very new to it, so I would highly recommend starting with The Rime of the Ancient Mariner if you haven't read poetry before. I thought it was a really great poem. It's another story within a story. We have this gentleman on his way to a wedding, and he is stopped by a very interesting older looking gentleman, and he kind of has this ability to really hold you with his stare. Like you cannot get away once he's looking at you. And he starts telling this gentleman, this wedding guest, a story. And we as the reader are also being told this story of what happens on a ship. He's on an expedition down to Antarctica, and he shoots an albatross, which is usually seen as good luck. And things start happening after that. Everything in this poem is so symbolic and matters, every single word, and you just feel like you're there. Like this one passage here where it's storming and the men are on the boat. Listen, stranger, storm and wind, a wind and tempest strong. For days and weeks it played us freaks, like chaff we drove along. Listen, stranger, mist and snow, and it grew wondrous cold. And ice mast high came floating by, as green as emerald. And through the drifts, the snowy cliffs did send a dismal sheen. Nae shapes of men, nae beasts we ken, the ice was all between. The ice was here, the ice was there, the ice was all around. It cracked and growled and roared and howled, like noises of a swound. At length did cross an albatross, through the fog it came. And an it were a Christian soul, we hailed it in God's name. The mariners gave it biscuit worms, and round it flew. The ice did split with a thunder fit, the helmsmen steered us through. And a good south wind sprung up behind, the albatross did follow, and every day for food or play came to the mariner's hollow. In mist or cloud, on mast or shroud, it perched for vespers 9, whiles all the night through fog smoke white glimmered the white moonshine. God save thee, ancient mariner, from the fiends that plague thee thus. Why look'st thou so? With my crossbow I shot the albatross. And so he does this, and the poem continues. That is all at the beginning of the poem, and it's insane. And it's so good. I love it so much. Oh my goodness. I'm really excited to keep reading this, but I'm going to take my time with it throughout the year. And I had mentioned, I believe, in a previous video that I had been recommended a couple times to read this alongside Middlemarch, as George Eliot was heavily influenced by the Romantic poets, and that Lyrical Ballads in particular is really, really good to read alongside Middlemarch. So that is why I started it this year, and am very excited to continue. That was a very long discussion about these 5 poems, so we'll move on to some other books I read this month, but I just really enjoyed my time with them. Alrighty, so we'll move on to the books that I finished in February, the full-length novels, and we'll start off with the lowest of the bunch. And this one, I kind of landed, I struggled with rating it, to be completely honest. I at first gave it 2.75 stars, and I think I still have it as 2.75 on Goodreads. Upon reflection, and as time has gone by, I have found myself thinking about it more, and I'm not sure about my rating. But I still would probably say it is my least favorite read of the month, even though it was not a terrible book. I do not think it was a terrible book. But I'm talking about Of Love and Treason by Jamie Ogle, and I feel very much in the minority with my thoughts on this one. I did actually buddy read this with a couple lovely, lovely people, Amanda from Book Lover Amanda and Tammy from Protagonist Pub. I'll have them both linked below. When we buddy read this, Amanda ended up loving it. Tammy ended up pretty disappointed, and I definitely agreed a little bit more with Tammy. I'm definitely in the middle. Like, I'm right smack in between Amanda and Tammy. I am one of those readers where when two people have very, very opposing views on a book, I can completely understand both opposing views. So as Tammy was kind of explaining the things that did not work for her and really, really frustrated her, I'm just like, yep, me too. And then Amanda, the emotional engagement that you experienced with this story, I'm just like, I totally understand that. So I was very much struggling with, how do I talk about this book? What do I actually think? And what do I actually feel? I will say though, talking about it with them really clarified a lot of things for me and helped me learn even more about my reading tastes and what I like. As someone who loves biblical fiction and historical fiction, ancient historical fiction, this book actually is ancient historical fiction. It was set in 270 AD in Rome. So people say if you like Francine Rivers' Mark of the Lion series, you would like this. And I agree with that to an extent. And actually Francine Rivers, she blurbed the book as well. But what I've learned about myself is that writing style makes it or breaks it. And tonality in the writing style makes it or breaks it. This book is about Valentine. If you know anything about Valentine, you know how the story will end. It's quite sad. It's quite an emotional tale. And in this story, Valentine is kind of given a romance. And we have our main character, Iris, who is blind. And she is really drawn to Valentine and to the church. And he is a leader in the church as well. And at this time, the emperor, he basically sets up this law where you cannot get married. and Valentine is performing secret weddings, and Iris kind of gets entangled in all of this, and the story goes from there. What I did enjoy was the sense of place. I felt like I was there in the markets, in her home, in the different places that the author was taking us. The way that she described the different locations was so wonderful and tangible, and you really felt like you were there. I felt like all my senses were being stimulated by the author's words, and it was very effective, the way that she described all the different locations that she took us. And part of the ending I did find moving and could relate to a lot of readers' more emotional response to the ending. I thought it was, very moving. But part of the ending also was very eye-rolly for me in many ways, and that takes me to 2 romances in the book. One of which came out of nowhere and did not work for me at all. The second of which I just was not captivated by and didn't feel it was really necessary to the story, and this is just my own subjective experience with the book. I do not think it's a terrible book. I do not think it's a bad book, and I'm in the minority. Most people love this book so much. And then I mentioned that because of this buddy reading experience, I was able to kind of learn more about what I like, and the tonality of this book, it felt I still struggled to kind of explain the tonality, but I very much prefer a writing style that feels a lot more, not somber is the wrong word, but less happy-go-lucky, if that makes sense. And that's why I love the Mark of the Lion series, and authors like Misu Andrews, like they have a bit of a serious touch to their writing, because they're dealing with really serious topics and serious events in history, if that makes sense. And this almost felt like too happy-go-lucky for what the story actually was in the tonality. And there were also various terms used that were quite modern, and just the writing style felt a little bit too modern for my liking. So again, I am not hating on this book. I think the author, for a debut as well, I thought it was well written, just not amazing, and not the book for me. So I'm still kind of at a 3-star-ish around there, and I am curious about her next book. I really disliked an aspect of the epilogue, and I'm not going to say what that aspect is, but I've heard that it is a setup for the next book that she's writing. So we'll see. I do want to try it, but I did struggle quite a bit with this one. A really, really big thing actually that didn't work for me is one of the characters, I guess, conversion, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but there is a character that experiences a conversion from Roman paganism to Christianity, and it was just like the flip of a switch. And while I do believe that things like that do happen, I guess just from my own personal experiences and the stuff that I've been through, I struggle to find those types of conversions as realistic, especially when it's a person who grew up knowing absolutely nothing about the faith. I had some really great discussions with Amanda and Tammy about this specific thing, how I am much more convinced by someone who really wrestles with the things that they see with their eyes. I'm much more compelled as a reader by someone like a Doubting Thomas, who's really fighting with what they're seeing, and I just find that more realistic personally. But I do think there are also miraculous things that happen. I don't know. I have some really great discussions about this. Someone may say, Miriam, it's not that deep. But to me it is, because this is a Christian ancient historical fiction. It's early church fiction. And I don't know. I want to be compelled. And I couldn't help but compare this book with the Mark of the Lion series and other books where the characters are on a journey to knowing God. They're on a journey to learning about Jesus, and especially the family, Marcus's family in the Mark of the Lion series. It's not like the flip of a switch. They're witnessing the things that are happening around them, and Hadassah is a big part of that, but it takes time, and it takes them really wrestling with a lot of really, really big questions, and that makes it a lot more compelling for me. So that was very rambly, but that is Of Love and Treason by Jamie Ogle. Not a terrible book, and I think this would appeal to so many Christians, and I think the author did a great job. struggled quite a bit with it, but again, not a terrible book, so a 3-star read for me. This next book I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about just because it is the second book in a duology, but I read Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. This is the second book in the Divine Rivals duology, and I had reread Divine Rivals in January for the Epistolary January readathon, and then I also reread it because I wanted to read this book but had forgotten a lot of what happened in the first book. So I reread it and then read this in February and ended up on a 3.75 up to 4 stars rating for this book. I honestly don't think I need to say anything about this duology at all, what it's about, just because it's everywhere. Everyone knows what this series is about. But if you don't, the first book, Divine Rivals, basically we have Iris and Roman who are rivals at this gazette, and they both end up going to the front lines. There's this war happening between opposing gods. And the war and the world feels very much like England in the 1910s. So it feels very much like it's the Great War, like World War I. There are the trenches, and just the way the battle is, it feels very much like World War I. Only instead of world powers, it is gods that are fighting. So we have Dacre and Enva, who are the 2 main gods. And they were also basically lovers in their past. So there's a lot more to why they are at war with each other than meets the eye. And in this book, we get more of that. So in the first book, Iris and Roman experience some really crazy things, and there's this huge cliffhanger at the end. And then this book, we learn more, and we're following both Iris and Roman separately. We're also following Dacre quite a bit in this book. And that's one thing that I didn't know really what I thought about at first. The author wrote Dacre in a way that made him feel a lot more human, whereas the times that Enva was brought in, she felt very like mythical and magical and like otherworldly, and they felt very different from each other, but they're both gods in this world. I was just kind of left feeling a little underwhelmed by the mythology aspects, and it was just a little lackluster, if that makes sense. Another thing that brought it down a bit for me, just a little bit, were some world building holes. But I did overall read this duology more for the relationship between Iris and Roman. I found their relationship very compelling. And a lot of people don't like this one as much because it deals more with the war itself. I actually really enjoyed that. And the whole letter writing and sending letters through the wardrobe still happens. And I thought that was really fun. So yeah, I landed on a 3.75. I thought it was a good ending to the duology, and I have heard that this author is writing another book within this world, and I think it has to do more with the gods. I could be wrong, but I am really intrigued. So I do really enjoy Rebecca Ross's writing style. She's a really great fantasy author, so that was Ruthless Vows. I also ended up reading Snowdrift and Other Stories by Georgette Hare in February, and this one was also a book that ended up working out for Feb Regency. As Georgette Hare, she wrote all of these stories set in the Regency era, and if you haven't heard of Georgette Hare, she is becoming a favorite author. I haven't read a whole lot of her books, but I do have, I don't know if you can see a lot of her books here, and the few that I've read were just wonderful. And she's written a lot of mysteries set kind of in her time, so contemporary to when she wrote them, which was, it would have been like the 30s, 40s, 50s, but she is more known for her Regency era romances. And I have to say, she is a go-to author for that time period. She is fantastic and so funny. Oh my goodness, her wit, her humor is just on another level. She's laugh out loud funny. And although it's a short story collection, and if you know my reading tastes, you know I'm not the biggest fan of short stories, I still had such a great time reading this collection. And I did actually have them listed in order, rough order, from my least favorite to my favorite, or rather in groupings of ratings. So for the 3-star reads, the stories were Bath Miss, Night at the Inn, The Duel, Pursuit, and Runaway Match. Then the 3.5-star reads were A Husband for Fanny, Pistols for Two, An Incident on the Bath Road, and Pink Domino. And then the top 5 that were just fantastic, that are 4 and 5-star reads, were To Have the Honor, Snowdrift, Hazard, Full Moon, and A Clandestine Affair. Oh my gosh, those 5 were so good. My 2 favorite were definitely Full Moon and A Clandestine Affair. The Full Moon story made me laugh out loud just so funny. I landed on like a 3.75 rating as an average of all the stories together, but rounded it up to 4 on Goodreads. And the thing with short stories, they're usually pretty forgettable. They're not long enough where I form enough of an attachment to the characters where I do remember them long term. So this is a collection that I'll be able to come to again in the future, and I won't have really remembered the stories, and it'll be fun to read them again. But I just love the Regency era, and I love how Georgette Heyer tackles a lot of the really fun things about this era. And in this collection, it's just full of elopements and running away to Gretna Green to get married, and marrying outside of your social class, and mistaken identity and parental interferences. She also uses a lot of slang in her books, and I did want to mention in these editions, actually, these editions are fantastic because at the very end of the book, they include pages and pages of slang and just different words and phrases that they would have used in the Regency era, just so that you aren't confused and have no idea what on earth the characters mean. The number of times the word foxed or intoxicated was used in this book, I'm glad I knew what that meant. It was really helpful. But she's just so great. And also fashion details. I love that she includes so many details of what the characters are wearing. And I love looking up pictures of what the fashion looked like, and it's just so much fun. She is truly just so good at immersing you in the early 19th century like no other, and I had a really, really great time with this. So that is Snowdrift and Other Stories. Much needed tea break. I have 2 more books to talk about, both of which were rereads, both of which were 5 stars. They're both classics, and they're just both amazing. Both very different as well from each other. This first one here, I read for Anne's Read the Classics challenge, and if you haven't heard of that, she just has a challenge for every month with scavenger hunt items and a challenge within the challenge, if that makes sense. So there's a prompt, scavenger hunt items for things to look for in the book you pick for that prompt, and then a third layer of that month is just a little challenge. So for February, the prompt was to read a Gothic novel, so I read Dracula, and then the scavenger hunt items were to read a book that features a nightmare, a skeleton, and a castle. It's Dracula. Definitely features all 3. I don't actually remember, I don't think it features like a skeleton? I don't know. But we're just gonna say it does because this is the book I went with. And then the challenge was to read like a booktuber. I am gonna kind of cheat for that and say that I read Sense and Sensibility. So I did. This is the last book I will talk about, but this book was the choice for Anne's, like, Jane Austen, celebrating Jane Austen in 2025. It's her 250th birthday this December, and this was the pick for February. So I'm reading like a booktuber because I read this like her and Charlene. This was their pick for that challenge. I am very much cheating with that, but that's what we're going with. Anywho, back to Dracula. So this book, like I said, was a reread. I first read it about 2.5 years ago, I think, and really, really liked it. I gave it 4.5 stars. Upon this reread, I gave it a full 5 stars. It was fantastic. I loved it so much. I don't even know where to start. I have so many thoughts, and they're a jumble, and I did take notes, but they're also a jumble, and it's because I listened to the Literary Life podcast episodes on this book, which were absolutely phenomenal, and I will probably be talking about that podcast a lot this year because I'm going to be trying to listen to their episodes as much as possible, read some of the books that they cover in their podcast, and they cover a lot of their books from a more Christian perspective, and it's really interesting. 2 of the hosts are Protestant and 1 is Catholic, and it's just really interesting to hear their thoughts. But wow, their analysis of this book and how religious it is, and fantastic. I guess I'll start off with a quote that they actually shared, and it is from a Gothic literature expert, Devendra Varma, and this is what they said. During the period when the forces of Christianity were nearly spent and materialism had dislodged spiritual values, the Gothic novelists planned their novels with an awareness of the deity and the consciousness of a just fate. The villains learn in due course that the wages of sin is death. And that is why I have come to appreciate and love Gothic literature because of that very reason. That kind of spiritual exploration and clear delineation where Dracula is not this villain that has a, tragic backstory and you're meant to sympathize with him, and the things you see in an anti-hero and the things that you see in more modern depictions of villains. He is clearly evil and he needs to be destroyed. And I just had such an appreciation for this story. It is not a horror story for horror's sake, and I just think it's fantastic. So this book is fully epistolary. It is told mainly in journal entries with a few other types of documents. And we have Jonathan Harker, who is a young solicitor. He's on his way to Transylvania to meet Count Dracula. And he's going there just because Dracula has recently purchased a property in England. And Jonathan Harker is just supposed to do some business with him, and he ends up in Dracula's castle, and that is all I'm going to say about the plot. I think you should go in knowing very, very little about what happens in this book. So that is all I will say about the plot specifically, but I want to talk a little bit about the characters. The characters in this book are absolutely fantastic. Jonathan Harker and his fiancée Mina are one of my favorite couples in literature ever. They are a power couple. They are the sweetest thing. I love them so much, and Mina is such a wonderful woman. I absolutely adore how Bram Stoker wrote her. I won't spoil anything, but I love how essential Mina is to the main mission in this book when it comes to Dracula's defeat in a way. Like, she is seen as just as important as all the men in this book. And every single man in this book sees her as such a powerful woman and treats her with such respect. And it's just so beautiful to see. And it's really interesting seeing how she's treated versus Lucy. Lucy is your typical kind of damsel in distress, and she's so focused in on her, potential love matches, and she has 3 different men proposing to her, and she definitely doesn't hate that. Mina, on the other hand, though, she is much more interested in developing her mind, and she uses a typewriter, which was this huge new invention at this time. But anyways, I could go on and on about Mina. She's just wonderful. But like I was saying, all the characters are fantastic in this book. Jonathan Harker, Mina, I love Dr. Seward as well. He was so interesting, and it's just a very interesting cast of characters. Dr. Seward is this kind of like a psychiatrist, the scientist, and we have Quincy Morris, who's this American Texan, gunslinger kind of vibe, but he's so sweet. Lucy's more timid, the typical damsel in distress, like I was saying. Arthur Holmwood, who is her love interest, he's the aristocrat of the story because every Victorian novel has to have one, apparently. And besides Mina and Jonathan, I think my favorite character has to be Abraham Van Helsing. That man has my heart. He has so much love in his heart. He is so self-sacrificing and so tenacious. I just love him so much. Van Helsing is wonderful. And just going back to comparing Lucy and Mina for a second, Lucy's the type of woman that inspires more romantic feelings in men, whereas Mina, she definitely attracts these men, but more in a platonic way, but in a more powerful way. Mina is more associated with like modernity and technology, and Lucy more with fun and flirtation and all of that. I really don't want to just keep going on and on about this book, but I really loved the allegorical elements as well, and like the religious elements that I really didn't pick up on the first time. And this is why I love rereading so much, especially rereading and then just listening to people pick the story apart. And I did mention a little bit about the modernity being shown in this story. And it's really interesting how at the beginning, Jonathan's on his way to Transylvania, where there's just superstition and old wives' tales, and everything feels very old world. And then throughout the story, we have all of these very modern things, modern technology, like dictaphones, phonographs, typewriters, trains. It's just so good. And I'm a wimp. I get scared very, very easily, and I can handle this book. So I feel like if I can handle it, anyone can. I highly recommend it. It's just fantastic. So that is Dracula. 5 big stars. I loved it. And last but not least, we have Sense and Sensibility by the one and only Jane Austen. And this book I read for the first time 3 or 4 years ago, and I gave it 4 stars the first time. This is why rereading is such a wonderful thing, especially with classics, because I read most of Jane Austen's works for the first time when I was still very, very new to classics, and I went in having expectations that weren't met. And I expected these dramatic romances with dramatic plot lines and just things that don't happen, especially in this book. Sense and Sensibility is not a book where romance is at the forefront, and it's not a book where you're going to be just swept off your feet. It's not like a Georgette Hare romance at all. This book is much more about sibling relationships and mother-child relationships and family relationships and personal growth. And romances do happen in the background more, and then at the very, very end. But I just appreciated this book so much more upon this reread because I took my time with it and because I went in knowing to not expect the dramatic romances that I had expected the first time. Also, this edition is really pretty and I love it. But this book, I gave it 5 stars upon this reread. I loved it so much. It's just a beautiful, beautiful story. And the title, Sense and Sensibility, I often hear people say that our 2 main characters, Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood, really are what the title says. Eleanor is much more the sister that has a lot more sense, and she's more prudent and is much less the type that wears her emotion on her sleeve. She's very much more controlled and kind of keeps her emotions back and is able to control herself. She has a lot more self-control, and Marianne is a lot more flighty and passionate and romantic and all of that. She has a lot more sensibility. And I definitely do agree with that. And I definitely do see how that's the case. But it was really interesting this time around seeing how they're not the only sibling pair where that's kind of explored. And siblings in general, it's a huge theme in this book. We have Eleanor and Marianne. They're very different. We also have Lady Middleton and Mrs. Palmer. Very interesting sister dynamics between the 2 of them. Lady Middleton is a lot more proper and doesn't really show emotion, and Mrs. Palmer is the complete opposite. And then we also have Lucy and Anne Steele. So we have multiple sibling pairs in this book, and I recently saw a video from Katie from Books and Things where she basically analyzed siblings in this book. I'll have the video linked below. I thought it was fantastic, but I just love siblings in books. It's always been something that I love reading about. Maybe because I grew up in a big family. I'm the oldest of 5 and I love my siblings so much, and I just love siblings in books. It's something that gets me and really tugs at my heartstrings in such a strong way. Even if the siblings in the books that I read don't always get along, I still love that dynamic being explored and I love reading about it. So it just was something that I really, really enjoyed this time around. So in this book, Eleanor and Marianne and their younger sister Margaret, who is barely ever talked about, she's barely on page, but their younger sister Margaret and their mother Mrs. Dashwood, they have to leave their home Norrell Park because Mrs. Dashwood's husband has passed away. Everything that he had was left to his son from a previous marriage, and they could have lived with him at Norrell Park if it weren't for his terrible wife, Fanny. So the Dashwood girls leave and they move into Barton Cottage, which honestly, I would love to live in a place like Barton Cottage. I love the descriptions of the landscape and everything around the cottage. They meet some really interesting characters as they are living in this new home, and we meet Sir John Middleton and Lady Middleton's mother, Mrs. Jennings, who was one of my favorite characters. She was quite annoying at times, but just so funny. And we meet the Palmers, and there were definitely a lot of characters in this book, so I wrote down a list of their names, and it was really helpful having a character list. And so these girls, we just follow them as they are in their new home, and they're interacting with their various neighbors, and they spend some time in London. And Marianne meets a man named Willoughby, and Willoughby is basically the main villain of the novel. And he was such a fantastic villain. I think he's a lot more compelling as a villain than someone like Wickham. Willoughby is a lot more complex in my opinion. He is very self-aware. He knows exactly what he's done and that it's wrong. And I love this one part later in the story where he just lays everything in front of Eleanor and she is just like, and he's very self-aware. We'll just give him that. But he's very, very unlikable. Both Eleanor and Marianne have love interests in the book. Eleanor's is Edward, and a lot of people don't like Edward. And I'll be honest, he is probably amongst my least favorite of Jane Austen's heroes. Not because he is a terrible hero by any means, but he is just a lot more withdrawn and shy, and he is just not the type of hero that I personally find interesting. He gets himself into a position that a lot of people find is his fault, and I do agree with that, but I can also feel sympathy for him. So there's that. And the one thing though that kind of annoyed me about him is he doesn't really show much of a drive to do much, and I understand he's kind of in his mother's shadow. She is not a very pleasant woman, and so he probably feels overwhelmed, but it takes him a while to kind of man up a little bit. But anyways, he's all right for me, but I do think he and Eleanor match. But again, I wasn't reading this book for their romance, and I didn't really care that there was a lack of intensity or whatever about their romance. I was here for Eleanor and Marianne and their development and their growth. And I love Eleanor so much, and I relate to her so much, especially as the oldest daughter. I relate to her so much. And then there's Marianne and Colonel Brandon, and Colonel Brandon is so underappreciated and underrated in my opinion. A lot of people are off-put just because of his age and the age difference and everything, and I can completely understand that. And in general, Marianne and Eleanor are quite young. I do believe the average age of marriage was older at the time, but it didn't really bother me personally, and I just think Colonel Brandon is so great. And at some point I read somewhere how Willoughby was pretending to be the romantic hero that Colonel Brandon actually is, and I just loved that comparison. I loved the way that was said, and I definitely agree. And Colonel Brandon, he is definitely a quieter person, but I do think he has a lot more passion within him and is perfect for Marianne, in my opinion. I just really appreciated this book so much more reading it this time. I caught on to a lot more of the humor than I did the first time, and even though this book isn't as funny as like Pride and Prejudice and Emma and even Northanger Abbey, I still found a lot of really funny moments that were quite subtle, and moments where Eleanor was catching on to the humor in a situation but wasn't really able to show that she was trying not to laugh, and it was just so fun. And Mrs. Jennings was so funny. This woman, yes, she got annoying, but I just love her. She has such a big heart, and even though she sometimes just couldn't shut up and she really needed to shut up in certain moments, she truly did everything out of the kindness of her heart, and she was really there for Eleanor and Marianne, especially in a moment where Marianne gets very ill, and I just thought she was a great mother as well to her daughters. And motherhood is another thing that I found interesting in how it was portrayed in this book, and I kept thinking about Mrs. Dashwood as a mother versus Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, and I would love to hear people's thoughts about the two of them and comparing the two of them, because in general people think Mrs. Dashwood is a better mother than Mrs. Bennet. But I've been thinking a lot lately actually about how Mrs. Bennet, she was a lot more stressed about her daughter's futures and tried to do more for her daughter's futures and to ensure that they were secure a little more than Mrs. Dashwood. But do you disagree with me? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Mrs. Bennet is so annoying, and I do feel like she would have driven anyone crazy, and I do feel for Mr. Bennet for being married to someone like that, but Mr. Bennet was quite lax, and Mrs. Dashwood, I feel, was just kind of clueless about ensuring your kids' future financial stability and happiness and all of that. I mean, she wanted her kids to be happy, but I don't know. I would love to hear your thoughts on the comparison between the two mothers. But that was Sense and Sensibility, and that was my second time reading it, and like I said, I gave it 5 stars. And I reread Mansfield Park last year, and I didn't rate it for my reread. I think the first time I read it I gave it 4 stars. The second time I really struggled with it just because I was in a huge slump when I read it, so I have to reread it when I'm in the mood for Jane Austen, and then I'll see where I sit with it, because right now Pride and Prejudice is my favorite. I have to reread Emma. That is the only one I have not read twice. So I've read all of Jane Austen's works twice, except for Emma. So I'm going to reread that this year for sure, see where I still stand with my thoughts. But Pride and Prejudice will always be my favorite. I'll reread Emma. This is probably within my top 4. Northanger Abbey. See, this is hard because I read Persuasion as well. I reread Persuasion. When I reread it, I changed my rating, I think from 4 to 4.5 stars, and said I absolutely loved it. But Persuasion should be also 5 stars because it's fantastic. I don't know how I would rank her novels. Maybe I should read them all 3 times and then make an official ranking video. I think that would be fair, but I think for literary merit, they're all deserving of 5 stars, but as to reading experience, that'll differ. But anyways, that was Sense and Sensibility. Those were the books that I finished in February. This was quite a long wrap up for just a few books. I read quite a bit less than I did in January, but it was a long and rambly wrap up. If you made it to the end of the video, thank you so much. It means a lot. And I do appreciate each and every one of you for taking time out of your day to watch my videos. It means the absolute world to me. But friends, that is it for this video, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.